Okay, so have you ever looked at something you just bought, like your phone or even a t-shirt, and wondered, how did this even get made? Like all the steps, all the places it had to travel through before it ended up in my hands.
It's wild when you stop and think about it, right? Like a global treasure hunt, but for everyday stuff.
Totally. And today we're going deep on that whole journey, getting into the nitty-gritty of why companies choose to manufacture in certain countries. It's a fascinating mix of economics, geopolitics, even culture comes into play.
Oh, yeah, it's way more complex than just find the cheapest labor, which honestly is what I used to think.
Me too.
Yeah,
But for this deep dive, we've got some seriously insightful research and case studies to unpack. Ready to get into it.
absolutely, let's do it.
Perfect. Now, our sources kick things off with this foundational economic principle called comparative advantage.
Right, comparative advantage. Basically, it boils down to certain countries being just naturally better suited, more efficient at producing certain goods. And this all comes down to differences in costs, the resources they've got, or even the specialized skills of their workforce.
So, like, a real-world example of that could be Bangladesh, right?
Exactly. Bangladesh, with its large and importantly low-cost labor force, has become this global powerhouse for, well, you guessed it, textile manufacturing.
It makes sense.
Right.
Clothes are relatively labor-intensive to make, so it makes sense to do it where labor is readily available and less expensive.
Precisely. It just wouldn't be cost effective for a country with like a much higher cost of living to try and compete on that front.
Okay, so cost is definitely a factor, but what about, like, those industries where you need a highly skilled workforce? Does that shift the balance?
Definitely. Think of a country like Germany, right? World renowned for their precision engineering.
Yeah, German engineering, the gold standard.
For sure. And they've got this comparative advantage in industries like automotive manufacturing, where it's not just about assembling parts, it's about that deep expertise, advanced technology, and high-level skills. It's about quality, not just churning out stuff cheaply.
So different countries kind of specialize based on their unique strengths and resources.
Exactly. But it's not just about costs and skills, right? Our sources also hammer home the critical importance of political and economic stability.
I guess from a business perspective, you don't want to set up shop in a place where everything feels kind of shaky.
Oh, absolutely. Companies, they crave predictability. Like a stable government, transparent policies, consistent regulations, those are the things that make long-term investments way less risky.
Right, if you're a company, you're about to pump millions, if not billions, into building a factory somewhere.
You better believe it. The last thing you want is some political upheaval or sudden regulatory changes that could, like, completely derail your whole
It's
operations.
like building a house on like a fault line. You're
hmm
just asking for trouble.
Yeah, exactly. And speaking of factors that might not be so obvious at first glance, our sourcing bring up this other really interesting point, culture.
Culture, huh? I wouldn't have immediately thought of that, but I bet it plays a bigger role than we realized.
Oh, way bigger. It goes so much deeper than just language barriers. Culture shapes, like everything, work ethic, communication styles, attitudes toward authority, even how people approach problem solving.
Whoa, that's a lot to consider.
Yeah.
So, like, even if a country seems perfect on paper, if their work culture clashes with your company's culture,
It can be a recipe for disaster. You could have all the right resources, the best technology, but if you can't get your teams to work together effectively because of cultural
it
misunderstanding,
all falls apart.
exactly. Companies really need to invest time and effort into understanding the local culture, like the nuances of how things work, how people communicate, and even unspoken rules and expectations.
Otherwise, you're setting yourself up for miscommunication, conflict, and ultimately lower productivity and morale.
Definitely. Okay, so far we've got cost, expertise, political stability, and even culture as these huge driving forces in where companies decide to manufacture. But our sources dig into this other super interesting concept, location externalities.
Location externalities, huh? What are those exactly?
Yeah, so it sounds kind of jargony, but it's a pretty simple idea at its core. It's all about the benefits that a company gets just by being located near other businesses, especially those in the same or like related industries. Like imagine Hollywood.
Oh yeah, Hollywood. I think I see where you're going with this.
Right. It's not just a bunch of studios randomly scattered around. You've got this Crazy concentration of talent, film schools, equipment suppliers, special effects companies, all these specialized skills and resources all in one place.
And they all benefit from being in close proximity to each other.
Exactly. It creates this powerful ecosystem that feeds itself, like attracts talent, drives innovation. Same thing happens in tech hubs like Silicon Valley or Cyberbad in India, this huge tech hub that sprung up.
So being in the right spot, surrounded by a cluster of similar businesses, can actually supercharge your growth. It's like that whole rising tide lifts all boats kind of thing.
Totally. But okay, even if you've nailed down all these factors, costs, stability, culture, location, our sources point out this other huge variable that can make or break your whole manufacturing strategy: exchange rates.
Exchange rates, huh? I vaguely remember that from Econ 101, but how does that play into all of this?
It's a bigger deal than most people realize. A country that looks like a manufacturing paradise one day can become way less attractive if its currency suddenly strengthens. Like take Japan, for example.
Yeah, Japan. I'm listening.
So after World War II, Japan was this manufacturing powerhouse, right? And a big part of that was because the Japanese yen was relatively weak. But over time, as the yen gained value, producing goods in Japan and then selling them internationally became more expensive.
So did Japanese companies just, like, accept smaller profits? Or was there another way to adapt?
Well, many of them actually ended up shifting their manufacturing operations to other countries where costs were lower. Places like, East and Southeast Asia, where their currencies were weaker against, say, the US dollar. It became all about finding that balance between production costs, currency values, and access to those key global markets.
It's like this intricate global dance,
Yeah.
constantly adapting to these economic shifts.
It really is. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, but there's one last hurdle our sources highlight, and it's a big one: trade barriers and government regulations.
Trade barriers, like tariffs and stuff.
Exactly. Tariffs, quotas, and restrictions on foreign investment, all that can really throw a wrench in your plans, even if a country seems perfect based on all those other factors we talked about.
So you could spend months, maybe even years, meticulously planning a new factory, getting everything lined up perfectly, only to have the rug pulled out from under you with, like, a sudden trade war or new regulations that make it impossible to actually operate profitably.
Yeah, that's the nightmare scenario. It's like planning the perfect road trip, mapping out the ideal route, but then hitting unexpected detours and road closures that completely throw you off course.
Talk about frustrating. So after all this, what's the big takeaway? It seems like choosing where to manufacture is, like, ridiculously complicated.
It is. It's this intricate web of cost calculations, political assessments, cultural considerations, all while navigating a constantly shifting global landscape. There's no simple answer, no one-size-fits-all formula.
Okay, so for our listeners out there, why should they care about all of this? What's the so what moment here?
Well, think about it this way. The next time you pick up a product, anything, and you see that little made in label.
Yeah, that little label we usually just glance over.
Exactly. I encourage you to pause for a second and think about the incredible journey that product took to get to you. It's not just a random place on a map. It represents a whole series of complex decisions made by companies influenced by all these global forces we've been talking about.